Because he wanted to see how big his liver is, the guards of Phu Quoc prison cut open the abdomen of soldier Tran Huy Moc, then sutured it with 17 stainless steel threads so that the prisoners had to die gradually and die in pain. On one occasion when we went to collect artifacts of revolutionary soldiers who were captured and imprisoned by the enemy, we went to the family of Mr. Tran Huy Hung, Nguyen Giap Commune, Tu Khai District, Hai Duong Province, and heard this story. Mr. Hung said that his father, Mr. Tran Huy Moc, was born in 1949 in Quy Chau Village, Nguyen Giap Commune, Tu Khai District, Hai Duong Province, enlisted in December 1967, is a soldier of the 7th Company, 3rd Battalion, Hai Duong Province. In March 1968, he was on the payroll of the 3rd Company, 140th Battalion, Quang de Front. In November 1969, while on the task of transporting cloth to the base to sew clothes for the troops, he was discovered and arrested by the enemy. In November 1969, they held him in Phu Quoc prison, the largest U.S. prison, in Hue. The brutality in this place is far more than in other prisons. Mr. Moc was tortured by them in the most cruel way. Beaten with batons, electric whips, taking planes, submarines, nailed, buried alive, grilled on fire, put in a drum full of water and then tapped the barrel with the butt of the gun until the nose bleeds and perforated the eardrum. And yet, from officers to soldiers, the puppets blatantly intercepted the prisoners' food, making the prisoners miserable, starving and dying gradually. During his imprisonment in prison, the enemy used all extremely brutal torture tactics to exploit information, but with his resilience and bravery, Mr. Tran Huy Moc resolutely refused to declare even though the enemy's torture caused him to die and come back to life many times. Looking up at his father's photo, Mr. Hung choked up. In 1969, the family received a death notice, so they thought that he had sacrificed. In March 1974, my father returned with wounds on his body, especially 17 stainless steel stitches. When Mr. Tran Huy Moc was alive, Mr. Hung often took his father to meet his former comrades and heard the story when he was captured by the enemy. He said, the enemies used all kinds of torture and brutal beatings, but my father insisted on not declaring. Then they asked, "Where is your hometown?" My father said, Yuan Giap. That is, Nguyen Giap Commune in my hometown. The enemies thought that my father had taken out the name of General Vo Nguyen Giap to scare them, so they demanded that his stomach be cut open for the purpose of seeing how big his liver was, and carrying General Vo Nguyen Giap to threaten. They hit his father on the head with the butt of a gun, causing him to faint. Then the Americans used knives to cut the abdomen, and then the puppet soldiers used stainless steel thread to sew the abdomen. When he woke up, my father saw that there were 17 stitches on his abdomen, each 1 centimeter apart. Initially, the swollen stitches made him constantly live in pain. After a while, the wound healed somewhat. Seeing that Mr. Moc was still alive, the enemies continued to beat him, even aiming at his abdomen so that sharp metal threads tore his flesh. There were times when my father fainted. They thought my father was dead, so they were going to throw the body away. Fortunately, he can still bear it, said Mr. Hung. Speaking of this, Mr. Hung couldn't stop crying. He continued, I heard that my uncles who are my father's comrades said that they did this because they wanted to test a new type of torture so that prisoners of war would not die immediately but suffer from pain and torture every day due to necrotic wounds. When they can't bear it, the prisoners are forced to declare information. Despite being subjected to such brutal torture, that revolutionary soldier was still resilient and indomitable. Even in any situation, when he was still breathing, he still had to fight. In March 1973, Mr. Tran Huy Moc was returned under the terms of the Paris Agreement, January 27, 1973. As one of the revolutionary soldiers who was severely disabled due to many brutal tortures by the enemy, after being handed over, he was taken to Tuen Quang Provincial Sanatorium to treat his wounds. In March 1974, Mr. Tran Huy Moc was a Class 4/4 invalid who was discharged to live in his hometown. Mr. Hung continued, my father suffered from severe sequelae due to the torture of the enemy, especially the stitches with stainless steel thread that tortured him every time the wind returned to the sky, making daily life very difficult. There were days when it was too painful, his mind was unstable, he used to leave many times. The family situation was poor, my mother was also sick often, our brothers had to ask people around the village to look for him, but they found him lying wandering along the road. In the days when he returned to live in his hometown, his family situation was extremely difficult. Mr. Moc had to hunt for crabs and catch snails to live through the day. Once, due to soaking in pond water for too long, the stitches were ulcerated and festered. He was taken to the commune health station and removed 2 stitches. In 1987, the poor thatched roof house burned down, losing 2 stitches and his death certificate. In December 2011, due to old age, weakness, and frequent recurrence of wounds, Mr. Tran Huy Moc passed away. In November 2017, the grave of Mr. Tran Huy Moc was reburied. It is strange that when excavating the grave, Mr. Hong counted all 17 stainless steel threads in Mr. Moc's remains. However, there were 15 noses on the abdomen and 2 noses on both sides of the arm bones. Thus, it can be affirmed that in the days in Phu Quoc, Mr. Moc was also sewn up by prison guards on both arms. With the desire to preserve and propagate to generations in order to promote the historical value of artifacts about revolutionary soldiers imprisoned at the Vietnam Military History Museum, we have raised the issue of collecting 17 stainless steel stitches and approved by the family. Presenting artifacts to the museum staff, Mr. Hong was touched. These points are the clearest evidence of the crimes of the U.S. imperialists and their henchmen. The family hopes that the museum will preserve and promote the value of these artifacts in order to help today's generation better understand the process of struggle for strength and indomitability of the revolutionary soldiers who were imprisoned in the resistance war against the U.S. to save the country. Source: Vietnam Military History Museum. History is not to be learned, but history to be engraved in the heart, to be grateful and proud.